Without much further ado, let me introduce our fantastic second lecturer, or keynote actually, from today, Patricia Reed, who is a theorist, an artist, a designer who is based in Berlin in Germany. She is co-head of the Critical Inquiry Lab, a Master in Arts program in design research at the Design Academy in Eindhoven here in the Netherlands. So recent writings have been published in Navigation Beyond Vision, Ceremony, Burial of an Undead World, KI-Realitäten, Modelle, Praktijken und Topologien Maschinelles Lernen, The Unnamed, Pages Magazine, Glasby Journal, The New Normal, Construction Site for Possible Worlds, eFlux Journal, and eFlux Architecture, so not impressive at all. Reed is also affiliate researcher of the Antiquitera program in the US, and is area lead for the Design, Technology, and Materialization program at the School of Materialist Research. She's also co-writer of the fantastic, amazing Xenofeminist Manifesto, As Laboria Cubonics. This text really changed the wiring of my brain back when it appeared. A book that has been now also published by Verso back in 2018 and has been translated, another really interesting topic, translated into several other languages, among them Greek, Korean, French, and Espanol. So Patricia has also been awarded, very nice, an Agent of Change grant in 2023 from the International Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam, for which she is preparing a monograph entitled Figuring Planetary Space, also a fantastic title. A compilation volume of all of Patricia's work will be released by Olobionte Ediciones in Spanish this year. So I don't know if it's already, but it is forthcoming. Patricia is going to talk today about one of those concepts, Deleuzean concepts, that I think has been somehow relegated, shame. Well, I'll leave that to Patricia, as one of the ways to fight ignorance and stupidity, I guess. So I will leave the floor to Patricia, and I ask everybody to help me with a cool welcome, please.
Thanks for the, you can hear me now? Yeah. Thanks for the super nice introduction, Heidi, and really grateful to be here, very kind and honored to receive the invitation. A little bit intimidating, because I'm not really Deleuzian, but you know that, and so at your own risk, you know. So yes, by the title today is Instituting the Intolerable, and I'll just say that I've been in a bit of an angry mood the last months, so that should be transparent in the title. And, but in all seriousness, I did struggle with the invitation, not only because I'm not a Deleuzian and like you're sitting in front of a room full of like people that can speak, you know, in high resolution about Deleuze. And when I say I'm non-Deleuzian, I don't mean I'm anti-Deleuze. I think I was more sort of perturbed by these almost like intellectual, existential doubts about, you know, what does it mean to enact philosophy today in the present context, and of course, you know, do so accountably, taking up your time, my time, through this lens of instituting, which, as you maybe know from this morning's session, we were given sort of keywords to kind of to work with. So it's basically working through these reservations, or this existential crisis, you could say, that I kind of found a kinship with, you know, that emerged with Deleuze and Guattari. That's kind of more of an ethos, I would say, more than like a specific thing. And because like an ethos isn't really readily citable in that sense, it's really much more concerned with this like broader issue of how philosophy reckons, like how philosophical thought, more precisely, not the discipline of philosophy, but how philosophical thought reckons with atrocity. So of course, you know, more specifically, what Deleuze repeatedly referred to as the intolerable. So while atrocity and the intolerable are both sort of expressions of moral judgment, the intolerable is notable, I think it's a notable terminological choice, since it gestures to thresholds of sensitivity. Whereas atrocity is about like adjudicating the contents of an event. So with a broad brushstroke, we could say that atrocity is something that happens as an arrested sort of projective externality, as in like this atrocity happened there. Whereas the intolerable is a perception that mingles exteriority and interiority, belonging to an embedded position that cannot deflect and point over there, because ultimately there is no separable over there. So for Deleuze, the intolerable is a recognition of this complicity without the precondition of guilt. And I found this quite helpful for navigating my own existential crisis in the present. So a two-part question, I think, for me arose in this recognition of these concepts. And in what conditions of sensitivity, and I mean understood in the broadest way possible, of course including its obverse, insensitivity. So in what conditions of sensitivity are thresholds between the tolerable and the intolerable rendered perceivable? And additionally, how are these thresholds made intelligible so that we don't lose sight of this question on a sort of more an epistemological register, which is more my comfort zone than the affective sphere? And finally, how are conditions of sensitivity and insensitivity instituted? How do these conditions effectively model and shape organs of sense that are adapted to their idealized conditions, which very much could very well be at odds with actual empirical conditions? So less abstractly, I think it's important to note, as was mentioned in the kind introduction, these questions emerged from the context of present-day Germany, from Berlin, where I've lived since 20 years. So German memory culture has been widely lauded for grappling with its mid-20th century atrocities through this lens of guilt. And there have been massive efforts not to be brusquely dismissed nor reduced to a distorted caricature. I emphasize, however, the mid-20th century, since it was only in 2021, after decades of diplomatic, activist, and scholarly, sort of pressure, that the genocidal activity upon the Herero and Nama peoples between 1904 and 1908, of what today is present-day Namibia, was formally recognized. So this atrocity plays little to no role in the historical narration of the striated and gridded space of the state, as Brian Masumi put it in 1,000 Plateaus. And it's largely sequestered within sort of decolonial studies departments. And of course, those departments now increasingly are becoming sort of demonized as bearers of hate in the current climate. Now, considering the sequence of significant 20th century atrocities, we can't help but recall Aimé Césaire's succinct observation that fascism in Europe is but the boomerang effect of colonial domination returned home. So while charges of selective empathy are often populating protests these days in Berlin, the aforementioned example would sort of reactively have us diagnose an analog as selective guilt. As an important pivot, however, I think what's crucial to draw from in Deleuze's working through of atrocity, not to mention his anti-fascist political commitments that are of obviously particular relevance today, is that by shifting the discussion from atrocity to the intolerable, we also shift from the domain of guilt to one of shame. This shift is more significant than it may first appear, since one is guilty or not for something or someone, whereas shame compels us before something or someone. And this difference between before and for is quite significant in this discussion around the intolerable and shame. So in the words of Deleuze and Guattari from What is Philosophy, we are not responsible for the victims, but responsible before them. In other words, one doesn't need to be a guilty perpetrator of an atrocity to nonetheless be held accountable before it. This distinction between guilt and shame does not eradicate nor diminish the culpability of perpetrators, as Deleuze and Guattari definitively note, inspired, of course, by the work of Primo Levi, but is a commitment, philosophical and otherwise, of embedding our activities within historical time and the compromises that are made within it as socially affected and affectable creatures. So as they're keen to note, this complicity with the intolerable need not be such an extreme example, as is the case with Primo Levi. So in their words, we also experience it in insignificant conditions, before the meanness and vulgarity of existence that haunts democracies, before the propagation of these modes of existence and of thought for the market, before the values, ideals, and opinions of our time. What one reads both explicitly as well as implicitly between their lines, it sort of ties into this existential crisis I mentioned earlier. So what one reads explicitly in their account of shame is a working through of the purposefulness of philosophical thought itself in the wake of 20th century atrocities. And of course, it's well known they're not, alone in going through that effort. So shame, they note, entered philosophy via Heidegger as a thinker of a state, reterritorialist on Nazism, albeit not exclusively him alone. So the case of Heidegger serves as a very severe example of the complicity between the discipline of philosophy and the state. As Brian Masumi pointed out, the 19th century founding of the University of Berlin by Wilhelm von Humboldt, which became a model of higher education in Europe and the US, was seen as a place for the, quote, moral training of the nation, end quote, grounded on an original principle of truth to which justice is related, and all of which would be unified by the mega institution of the state. And in that framework, each student mind would emerge as a, quote, organized mini-state. So while guilt may be attributable to particular philosophers, shame is more powerful because it summons a depersonalized recognition of the complicity with the discipline of philosophy in all of its capacities, now sullied. And for Deleuze and Guattari, it compels a fundamental retooling, a non-philosophy, they call this. We can also find some echoes here with Lewis Gordon's sort of articulation of the pitfalls of disciplinary decadence. So a merely guilty singular philosopher could easily be cast aside as an abject aberration in an otherwise tolerable field. But without the catalytic unsettling of shame, the grounding of philosophy, in this extreme exemplary case, bound to the state, remains undisturbed. So it's from this, horrendous background condition that Deleuze and Guattari warn against a purely axiomatic picture of philosophy, cleaved from lived experience. That, in the words of Aline Wiame, conceals oppression through concepts. The axiom of human rights, a veritable juridical achievement of abstraction in 1948, is a case in point. Since one need only contrast this ideal and the states, of course, that narrate themselves via this otherwise admirable concept with the actual unfolding of 3 concurrent genocides in our present, and whose empirical artifacts are readily available. So a schism can be seen between the ideal and the empirical, between the concept and modes of existence, which may unto itself contribute to a perception of shame. And this, I think, is frontally epitomized in Frantz Fanon's letter to a Frenchman during the occupation of Algeria, when he wrote, "Concerned about man, but strangely not about the Arab. Worried, anguished, torn. But right out in the open, your immersion in the same mud, in the same leprosy. For there's not a European who is not revolted, indignant, alarmed at everything, except at the fate to which the Arab is subjected." So I think part of this ethos that I was speaking of earlier that I've gleaned as an admitted amateur of their work is twofold. For philosophical thought to renounce any search for an original principle, and therefore an ultimate stable ground, yet also for philosophy not to get deliriously carried away by concepts without vigilantly intersecting them with the domain of existence, the domain of practice. And I think this is quite important, quite an important approach not to lose sight of in a kind of planetary turn, which is more my branch of philosophy than what I'm doing today, that I think often bends towards statistical generalization at the expense of particular difference. So as Deleuze noted in a conversation with Foucault, practices are required for, quote, piercing the wall, end quote, that inevitably all theories will hit. So one sees the currents at work here, of course, with that backdrop sort of painted, with their philosophical nomadism that rejects territorialization in state space, which, as you know, a good North American, I need to add some pragmaticist takes in this, which includes, I would add, in Salarzian terms, its particular space of reasons that determine what counts and is legible as reasonable at all. So if shame is what enables the labor of both unsettling the grounding of thought, implying the respatialization of reasoned pathways, whilst also interfacing concepts with the domain of existence, this is precisely why it is described by Deleuze and Guattari as one of philosophy's most powerful motifs. So Deleuze drew from the testimonies of Auschwitz survivor Primo Levi, as is well known, who, as a prisoner of the Nazi death machine, nonetheless experienced shame upon surviving. Levi described this experience as the shame of being a man, in which he does not flatten nor equate all of man's activities as if we're all guilty, but asks, how could men, other than myself, commit such atrocities? So it's this shame of being a man, and it's sometimes, in English at least in the translation, it's like a man or man. I guess we have to decide. So the shame of being man that so deeply touched Deleuze is not a genre of egoistic shame, like being judged by the other in a kind of bad light, but is rather about, as Aislinn O'Connor has written, quote, one's indifference to the other and one's capacity to buffer oneself against what is intolerable in the world, end quote. So before elaborating in higher resolution about this shame, which O'Connor qualifies as a primary intersubjective affect that enables belief in a world, I think it's worthwhile to pause for a moment to firstly further distinguish between this guilt and shame that we've set up, and in doing so, expand the purview of shame to the epistemological plane, including its structural obverse that manifests in the instituting of ignorance. And second, to examine this figure of man, as in the shame of being man. So what is this figure of man in more historical and philosophical detail, coming to see him, and it is indeed a him, as an expression of what Sylvia Wynter calls a co-human negation, when this particular figure of man is inflated to the abstraction of humanity at large, and worlds come into existence in his image. So on the distinctions between guilt and shame, with an eye on grappling with atrocity through the lens of guilt noted earlier, Audre Lorde wrote, hang on, there we go, guilt is a response to one's actions or lack of action. If it leads to change, then it can be useful, since it is then no longer guilt, but the beginning of knowledge. So here we're already getting this kind of epistemological dimension. Yet all too often, guilt is just another name for impotence, for defensiveness, destruction of communication. It becomes a device to protect ignorance and the continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness. So it's here worth emphasizing that guilt is only useful if it catalyzes knowledge, that is, if it catalyzes thinking otherwise. And additionally, that guilt is a rather solipsistic, inward-directed state when not doing this work of catalyzing thought and action otherwise. So in summary, the problem or insufficiency of guilt following Audre Lorde is both epistemologically grounded as a defense of ignorance and atomistically self-referential. In contrast, shame is tethered to this outward gaze, implying becoming a witness to the intolerable, rather than the normative shame of being looked at in this kind of self-conscious light. We're still on, sorry, I'm ahead of myself here. So describing it in affective terms, for Deleuze, shame is what motivates ethics, despite a possibly guilt-free status. And it indexes a form of seeing that recognizes intersubjective complicity in various instances of oppression. For Deleuze, shame is an affect that unsettles habits of thought and indifference to a world. And indifference manifests as the conditioning of insensitivity by the blinders of cliché, to use his term. In bringing the limits of guilt in dialogue with shame, we must then move beyond an exclusively affective register of shame and engage with its intersubjective force on an epistemological level as well. So while I'm sympathetic to the argument that knowledge unto itself is insufficient in its own terms, since as we know, sheer awareness does not directly lead to the becoming other of a world, hence Deleuze's emphasis on desire in politics, it is nonetheless necessary to give a valence of orientation for that fuzzy other, to give other a quality of becoming other of a world, learning how to practice and thus be transformed by the consequences of concepts in lived activity. So what I'm suggesting is that alongside shame as an intersubjective affect, we can also specify an epistemological shame that is not deducible to good faith ignorance, as in simply not knowing, but a dogmatic ignorance elucidated by Primo Levi as actively wanting to not know. So shame as a primary affect enabling a witnessing of the intolerable, thus undergirding an ethics of accountability before the other, and a belief in a becoming otherwise of the world, shamelessness for Deleuze is what indexes ignorance, indifference, and or insensitivity to a world in its particular configuration. So just as shame, the impersonality of shamelessness circles back to the opening question of how conditions of ignorance, indifference, and insensitivity are instituted, effectively shaping organs of sense adapted to their idealized yet unrecognizably intolerable conditions. So as Deleuze wrote, as we heard this morning already, quote, every institution imposes a series of models on our bodies, even its involuntary structures, and offers our intelligence a sort of knowledge, end quote. Institutions are, another quote, an artificial means to liberate an organism from nature, though they subject it to something else, transforming tendencies by introducing them into a new milieu, end quote. So what I'd like to address through this synopsis is this kind of imposition of a model, and examine how some models, which are conceptually, which are conceptually kind of worlded into material existence. So for this, I think we need to turn our attention not necessarily just to instituting, but auto-instituting, driven by a conceptual self-model of the human, to which mesoscalar institutions like schools and banks and prisons and states, how these are referentially crafted. What we'll be examining here is basically the relationship between concepts and instituting, where this act of instituting across all scales can be seen as the sort of making operational of concepts. So just on a small side note, to give some more example about what I mean about operationalizing concepts, and a kind of a nod to Samatia's presentation this morning, this is a helpful concrete example of the operationalization of concepts that we see every day in our social media, social bubbles, and so on and so forth. So as Wendy Chun et al.'s work has addressed in their tracing of this sociological concept of homophily. So homophily was first coined in 1954, study on mixed-race housing, and has effectively become encoded as law in network science. And the automation of community in the sort of like online sense of whatever it means in this bubble world. So the organization of our experience on social media platforms via the automation of this assumption that, quote, similarity breeds connection, end quote, is not, of course, an engineering necessity, as Chun keenly emphasizes, but the instituting of a concept by means of algorithmic protocol. And one, of course, that has radically transformed our milieu of social interaction and the encoding of sensitivity and insensitivity, as well as our exposure to content in that particular milieu. So that's just a helpful example of how, concepts get operationalized. So I'll first sketch out a general premise of how these conceptual self-models of the human function as an auto-instituting, which is to say worlding operation, through the work of polymath Sylvia Wynter. And we'll come to see how man himself emerges as an intolerable model driver, such that the project of abolishing man, which has nothing nihilistic about it, comes into focus. So Wynter's project departs, from the origin of the universe to the development of rudimentary life forms to the so-called third event that marks the evolution of the human as a symbol manipulating species. So we're creatures with the capacity to create fictitious or artificial worlds for which Wynter deems us as homo neurons. This, of course, echoes Deleuze's notion of an institution as that which liberates the organism from nature. So the consequences of this evolutionary accident are what underwrite Wynter's historical and philosophical problem space. That as a species, we're hybrid biological and metabiological creatures, bios and logos mythos, and it's this condition that enables this unique auto-institution of human social organization, of course in ways that are both empowering and entrapping. So for Wynter, all societies, no matter their historical or geographic specificity, are auto-instituted primarily via the informal authority of these idealized human self-models. And of course, this doesn't mean they're ideal in an ethical sense, right? So said human self-models are regionally specific, and they, of course, yield vastly different societies, but the function of these human self-models as a law-like force is, for Wynter, quite universal. So Wynter names these idealizations as genres of being human. They're established by who we are statements, and they serve as a primary frame of reference for instituting practices, concepts, norms of social life. So basically what these human self-models set up is a referential schema from which economic, epistemic, normative orders cascade, and they establish both markers of selection and deselection, conformance and non-conformance, sensitivity and insensitivity. And because this feedback dynamic externalizes a particular genre of being human in formal or sort of institutional or informal or normative ways, a reproductive system of self-reference emerges that naturalizes compliance within a particular descriptive statement. So it's from this dominant referential constraint that knowledge and axiological systems affirmatively correspond to said human self-model, setting a constraint of self-reference through which societies come to adjudicate what is seen as tolerable, legitimate, relevant, good, true, and in fact necessary. So pairing Wynter's account with Deleuze, we may note that while institutions may liberate an organism from nature, the transformations of the milieu that ensue reciprocally naturalize so-called tendencies, which I would push further on and suggest that they naturalize concepts of necessity, often in both material and normative terms, as in, it is necessary for us to sell our labor power for shelter and bread. This human genre concept is often internalized as an absolute law of nature and indifferently practiced, making it difficult to recognize as an idealized model and not an unalterable fact. Shaping and habituating the organization of relations in social life, such a reproductive system of self-reference bends towards both the structuring and the evaluation of knowledge and value systems that basically confirm the veracity of said ideal model. And this is what Catherine McKittrick helpfully calls adaptive truth. And what I think Deleuze would likely classify more along the lines of cliché, right? These systems they're kind of like a gravitational pull, and all the institutions sort of revolve around this particular idealized figure. And in order for Wynter to account for this internalization of these institutions, she draws from the concept of sociogeny from Frantz Fanon, which essentially names that feedback process between the social structures and the internalization of them, such that no adequate description of the human can be achieved through biological categories alone, despite efforts, and claims to the contrary. So I think it makes it a very indispensable concept through which to account for the asymmetric conditions and experiences of being human. And of course, this is similar to the ethos noted earlier that I take from Deleuze and Guattari about the need to interface concepts with modes of existence and vice versa. Now, this generic human system model is what allows Wynter to explain how specific who we are statements, right? We were speaking at a very general systemic level, but how these very specific who we are descriptive statements have driven this expansive bracket of human history identifiable as long Euromodernity. So I borrow that term from Lewis Gordon. And this commences for her with the invasion of the Americas in 1492 through to the present day. So in Wynter's system, long Euromodernity passes through two phases of descriptive statements. So man 1 and man 2, which you see here, each of which has manifest as an over-representation that is conflating a certain narration of man with humanity at large, ultimately a move of conflating the normative with the natural. So both man 1 and man 2 operate as terms through which Western European cultures arrive at inventing and adjudicating otherness, however differently grounded. So basically, man 1 correlates with the Enlightenment humanism and the development of the physical sciences and marine navigation, so key figures Copernicus, Columbus. And in this instance, otherness is widely tethered to geography. And man 2 coincides with the bioevolutionary sciences, so Darwin, Malthus, where phenotypical, religious, cultural difference, and competitive economic fitness constitutes the human-animal, reasoning, non-reasoning divide of otherness. And of course, man 2 more familiarly exists as Homo economicus, which is, I think, a more familiar term. So as Badur Alagra wrote, the point of this, the violence of man's overrepresentation, is in its foreclosure of a non-hierarchical referent we in favor of man 1 and man 2 and nothing else. So simply speaking, the overinflation of man as a stand-in for humanity at large is what Wynter calls a co-human negation. And our globalized, planetary, socio-political condition is one driven by the imposition of this unilateral model genre of being human, or what McKittrick has called a monohumanism, that discursively institutes a referent we of humanity. So what Wynter is ultimately describing is a kind of worlding operation via the auto-institution of monohumanism, a worlding operation oriented and actually enclosed by a valence of co-human negation that instantiates a milieu that conditions our sensitivity in both ethical and epistemological terms. So I've been using this term sensitivity throughout this talk rather than the more familiar Deleuzean sensibility, insofar as it adheres to the interplay of interference and organization outlined by Alan Turing when discussing unorganized machines. So this is just basically a randomly constructed machine, not designed for any specific purpose. So in other words, entities premised on indeterminate becomings. So for Turing and his 1948 paper on machinic intelligence, intelligence in human and machinic forms is dependent on interference, quite straightforward, namely stimuli. So interference is what enables an unorganized machine to become organized via learning. So these interferences could be social, sensorial, or substantive, and over time, these interferences gradually establish a metastable state known as a configuration. And what this configuration does, of course, is condition future interferences, right? Condition the sensitivity to future condition the sensitivity to future interferences, even potentially, inductive prediction via the frameworks of this metastable configuration. So what I think is important to draw from this description is that configurations institute conditions of sensitivity and insensitivity to future interference, entrenching a form of sometimes debilitating stability to an otherwise metastable, which is to say, changeable entity. So while Wynter highlights our status as homo neurons, that storytelling alone seems a bit insufficient to account for the procedures of substantive narrative uptake and externalization. So in this way, Wynter's being humanist practice, I believe, can be given more procedural specificity through the lens of interference, such that we may be practically described as creatures of interference, namely homo interfatio. So worlds such as ours, driven by the auto-institution of Monohumanist Man, are sustained by a self-referential narration of completeness. Through the establishment of a metastable configuration, Wynter identifies as a grammar of regularities. Considering that grammar establishes a set of rules, we can diagram this as an enclosure of thought's given possibility space, scaffolded by the metastable organization of a social machine, including the conditioning of sensitivity and the criteria for the tolerable and the intolerable. The enclosure of an historical world analogously coincides with a machinic cognitive configuration that nurtures insensitivity to non-compliant interference, reinforcing a state of ignorance while perpetuating habitual or cliched organizations of purpose, meaning, value, and taxonomy. So the process through which a world encodes sensitivity and insensitivity to these artifactual and informational encounters with interference is localization. And because localization operates in world-preserving ways, transiting outside the constraints of self-referential enclosure, of cliched habituation, entails what could be described as a nomadic movement for, quote, piercing the wall of said enclosure that narrates itself as total with naturalizing effects. I'm recalling the keynote this morning was, you were mentioning Catherine Hales, and she always said, cognition's expensive. It's a big energy to think without habit. To conclude, it is this auto-instituting of enclosure delineated by the imposition of the monohumanist man model that forecloses on witnessing the intolerable, that enables the toleration of the intolerable in ethical and epistemological terms, even in the face of a daily stream of empirical evidence of atrocities otherwise. It is this schema of monohumanist man and the meta-instituting operations it territorializes that intolerably endorse a limit condition on sensitivity. For example, the threshold of the grievability of life outlined by Judith Butler, Charles Mills's white ignorance and colorblindness, who wrote, "So if Kant famously said that perceptions without concepts are blind, then here it is the blindness of the concept itself that is blocking vision." This a priori conceptual blocking of vision can be read in the literary work as well of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, where he writes about the construction of inner eyes, quote, "those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality," end quote. Mill's white ignorance and identification of moral non-knowings, of course, echoes Levy's indictment of not wanting to know and the intolerable conditions that can manifest in such structural and desired not wanting to know. So as Wynter herself notes, given that such auto-instituting procedures are, quote, and this is a mouthful, an indispensable condition of our being able to performatively enact ourselves as being human in the genre-specific terms of an I and its referent we, how can we then come to know our social reality outside the terms of the oi-socializing mode of auto-institution, in whose web-spinning field alone we are recursively enabled performatively to enact ourselves in the genre-specific terms of our fictive mode and kind, end quote. More simply stated, how is it possible to think from without the configuration of this world and the conditioning of insensitivity it institutes via its grammars of regularity or cliché? So due to the auto-instituted enclosure, driven by the imposition of the model of monohumanist man and the engineering of necessity to adapt to his law-like force, the overcoming of this co-human negation takes place as a nomadic movement of non-adaptation, because it implies the agency needed to construct discontinuities from recursively interpolating pathological naturalizations of man, his space of reasons, and his instituted world that conditions insensitivity to the intolerable. For Wynter, exiting the grammar of regularities that sustain this metastable, intolerable world is premised on the capacity to construct an outer view. This outer view is not a view from nowhere, but a comparative perspective, one of embedded complicity in an organized, striated and gridded milieu, naturalized as if complete, and one that is sensitive to the excess of self-referential completeness. It's in this space of friction that sensitivity to a becoming other of this world is both intelligible and perceptible. And it's here where we can mingle this idea of non-adaptation from man and the intolerable world made in his likeness with Deleuzian shame, which can be seen as a vehicle for unsettling enclosures of cliché or those grammars of regularity that work to condition an indifference to a becoming other of a world, as if the instituting of this world is in any way satisfactory in collectively satisfying ways. Shame, in this sense, takes us out of a solipsistic satisfaction and its inverse, hopeless indifference. It is a sensitive intensity where not only a form of empirical seeing of the intolerable emerges, but a diagrammatic seeing of the auto-instituted, modeled nature of our world that had been taken for the real or conflated with necessity itself. The shame of being man is more precisely the shame of complicity with a particular human self-model. So the project to abolish man, that is a project to abolish the self-model of man, is not a nihilistic demand, but a vital one, relinking to our conceptual and narrative capacities to reconstitute human self-conception, not only in the wake of today's intolerable atrocities, but to begin the labor of worlding the planetary. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia, for this really interesting presentation. I also love your slides. The slides are incredible. It will take me a while to really study them and read them carefully. We have about 5 minutes to run the microphone over the audience. Anybody would like to ask a question? Yes.
Thank you for this great presentation and for bringing in Wynter. I think she's like a really crucial thinker today, and she's so underrepresented. And thank you for these graphs. This is like fascinating and priceless. So I made sure to take a photo of each. So anyway, so I'm interested in her Wynter's assertion or search for we the ecumenically human. So this kind of understanding of the human on a species basis. So she says that we understand another race, another culture as if it were a different species. So our body recognizes the other in this very physiological sense as if it were another species. But can we ever actually understand ourselves beyond a particular genre of the human? So I guess you're trying to loosen up this auto-instituting or this kind of like separate species like mode of being. So kind of to loosen it up and trying to be together without so much separation. But can we ever actually be or exist beyond a particular mode of being human in this cultural sense?
Yeah. No, but I don't think that's what she's arguing for, right? It's more about, I think because she's not angry or disputing about the way auto-institution, at least according to her model, sort of organizes societies into like things that we recognize as like cultural difference and what have you. It's more the problem of the bloating. Right? It's just like, because that's the point of Man 1 and Man 2, is you have a very particular European thing. Okay, if it stays here, fine, no problem. The point is like, it comes to stand in for humanity at large. So it's basically, it's taking a particularity and making it a universal. And I know there's some people that are like, think, oh, we need Man 3. I don't happen to think that. I think it's more about the diversification of the genres of being human. Rather than like thinking we need to continue this trajectory of a bloated, singular way of practicing being human, for example, right? And I think there was a really nice, to kind of back that up, I think there's a really nice notion from Bernhard Stiegler, in I think the paper right before he passed away, where he was talking about the like structural elimination of the diverse as sort of a constitutive move of our time, both in terms of new diversity, but also like biodiversity, all these other things. And I was, a few years ago reading that in conjunction with this like, because there is that temptation to be like, oh, let's just do Man 3, but it's the wrong the wrong move. I'm not sure if that answered your question though. Yeah?
Patricia, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to ask something which is similar to what's already been asked. Maybe it's the same thing, but I'm asking it in different terms. So my understanding of Sylvia Wynter is that she follows very much Thomas Nagel's idea of an objective phenomenology. So basically the way she talks about this sort of self-consciousness of the human is like, being human means to belong to different genres of being human, but at the same time she advocates a capacity to know what it means to be human outside of the genres of being human. And the way she talks about it, I think, is through this kind of objective phenomenology, which means that basically objective phenomenology, which seems like a paradox, but she's mentioning this phenomenologist, Thomas Nagel, which basically is saying it's possible to know objectively what it is to be human by all those that share enough characteristics to consider themselves as being human. So basically, as long as you feel to belong to that kind of species, then you will have a sort of part in this objective description of being human. I think it's like the ecumenical project of the human, that she, like this sort of objective vision of the human, of phenomenological vision of the human is what brings her to Aimé Césaire's science of the word. So basically, this kind of objectively, phenomenologically recognized common character is the word. And so I was wondering what you think about this. So she so many times explicitly refers to Aimé Césaire's science of the word, the poetic side, the poetic aspect of the word, but also importantly, she, through his work, reminds us of the African origin of human self-consciousness and the word. So outside of Man 1 and Man 2, but not before, but she explicitly states that. So this kind of African origin of the word, so that to maybe trace a different kind of historical route, what could have been or what could be if the science of the word took different directions from the ones. So I was wondering what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm very honest, I don't have a lot to say on the objective phenomenology side, but not because I disdain, I literally don't have anything of value to suggest on it. I think on the Césaire thing, on the science of the word, I read it because for her, pursuing that is the new studia, right? Because she's calling for a kind of complete, or the fulfillment, not completion, I would contradict myself, fulfillment of the epistemological revolution that she attributes to Fanonian sociogeny, right? In the way that you also, which is curiously, you can tie that to also feminist epistemologies in the sense that you get a parity between propositional and tacit sort of knowing, right? And so I read, when she's doing this kind of work of endorsing or seeing that the new studia is manifest in this kind of Césarian, in that, I feel like she's really just trying to find different forms of education is the wrong thing, different forms of thinking that can encapsulate both the existential, but also the sort of ontological even. And I think ultimately, she's asking us to consider humanness at two scales at once. And that's where I think that there's some potentially very interesting Salarzian cross-readings there, right, with the manifest and the scientific image, because we're, yes, we have this ancestry. Does it affect my day-to-day life? Not so much, right? But that we're constantly being asked to change scales. And I think that's also one thing that's very much neglected in the reading of her work, where, I've been doing a lot of work on how these human genre concepts externalize themselves through representation, techne, artistic means, and so on. Not today, but in other things. And one thing that's very clear is that this particular figure of man ushers in a world at a very specific scale. And that is very dangerous for a planetary conception. And I don't mean just that it's large scale, I just mean that it's only one scale. Everything has to bend to it. And that is not uniform across all human cultures, right? You see it in just different ways that cultures deal with perspective, representation, very different than how the representational externalizations from this logic of figure of man relate to that. So I think that, and that's quite underspoken about her work, is this binocular vision of and I'm curious if anyone has any suggestions about, because of course you immediately jump to Marxian species being, right? But I have not really come across if there is a reading of Wynter who, turned away from Marxism eventually. I don't necessarily fully endorse that overly poetic route. I'm cautious about this, so when I mention it, I'm not endorsing it.
You're right, I think, in doing the Salarzian parallel, because what is it, the ontogenetic and sociogenic? Yeah. What is it, if not the manifest and scientific image that you were also talking about before? So I think it's this kind of binocular or synoptic vision that is what characterizes.
Exactly, yeah, and I think, and that also converses at different scales. So she's asking us to look at, to kind of coexist at multiple scales at once, at least conceptually, which I think is a really advanced way of thinking. Not to mention that as a figure, when we're going back to those existential questions of what it mean to practice, for her, who's in her 90s now, to have gone through all of this insanely dense scientific biological literature, especially when you don't have the internet and you just can't download all these papers as easily as we can, is absolutely remarkable. So I think even as an ethos, which was also what I was taking some inspiration from Deleuze and Guattari, that a transdisciplinary thinker, but like a real one, not just in label alone. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Patricia, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.